Hello everybody. So we're just going to have a look at gaps. So I'm going to look at your typical daily gap, and that's the opening gap that we're all familiar with. But I'll just point out, a couple of things how I trade it, and then the second thing is I'm going to have a look at the Brooks gaps, and we'll have a squiz at how that all works out, and maybe explain it so you can understand it and learn how to pick them up. So first things first. Gaps. Okay, so I'm on the Aussie right now and on the hour chart, and there are gaps galore. Every day has been so volatile that we've had big gaps to the up and to the down often. So what I want to point out is a gap is really a sign of strength. Okay, so you see we're moving down on this particular gap here, and then we gap down. Right now, the first question you've got to ask yourself is where we're gapping to. So what I mean by that is get your levels in. Okay, so you can see here the first bar is here. So in all probability, you would have been waiting to see what happens at this level. And we had a breakthrough with vigor. And let's just save ourselves some trouble and just head to the left. Okay, I don't have enough data to see, but there's probably a level further down. But regardless, so prices moved down. We've had this big gap to the downside, to the 670 pip gap to the downside. So that is a sign of strength, and you'd expect some form of continuation, which it does, and then it forms a base. Okay, but now, how do you trade the close? So a lot of people will say, get in here and say, right, I'm long for the close of the gap. And it's the wrong thing to do, because there are other parts of this pattern that actually take cosmos before the gap. So it's almost like a hierarchy of levels. And the first one is the opening. So this area here, that is the area where immediately profit taking will happen and sellers will step in. Regardless, it always happens. Okay, and you can see how we form this base, and you'll have bulls that are sit here and they're aiming for this gap, and what will happen is bears will step in over here and sell this thing off, and it happens every time. Okay, the next thing that is important is the bottom. So you can see there's a low there, and this is just really a major level. So again, bulls will be down here and they'll be aiming, so from this gap here, they'd be aiming to close this gap. But have a look. What happens? We hit there and we gap down. Okay, the third attempt is where the gap closes. And there it closes. Okay, and that is typically how these opening gaps play out. So the gap to the downside, often you want to see what the strength is, and you need to use your daily levels as well. And I will normally use the Ichimoku cloud to see whether we're in the right direction or not. If we're trending to the downside, then this gap down with a big gap like that, there's normally continuation. Just play the continuation until a bottom forms, or we hit another level. Okay, and playing for the gap close. The actual gap close is the last part of that gap. Okay, occasionally you do see, like this one here, you've got a nice gap up, and then you've got two range bars, and then we spin all the way back and we close it. This is what's been going on recently. Okay, so this is kind of not the norm for how these gaps play out, but what's been happening on the Aussie. You have been having days where it's come back to close. But how I've explained it to you here, that is the area that has more effect, okay? And especially for gaps that have been open for a long time. Let's see if I can find, I don't want to look at inside all that volatility. Oh, here's a great one here, okay? So there's the gap close. There's the previous low. Okay. And there is the top of this gap. So we gap down, and this was a massive gap down. So you would have expected some form of continuation, but there's probably a level. Yes, there's a level. See how price is interacting at this point. So it's gapped down and it's hit the level. If it finds support at this level, which it often does, because 80% of your breakouts fail, then price is going to come back. First come back and test this area, which it does. Okay, come back. Then it's going to come back and try and test this area. Okay, which it does over here. It fails here, but it does over here. But it doesn't close the gap. That gap is still open. It comes off, and then it comes up to close the gap. So that's how price happens, and especially when you find gaps have been open for over a month, or a couple of weeks, or a couple of days. This is how it plays out every single time. Okay, so let's move on. Let's look at the Brooks gap. I just want to get rid of all this stuff. Okay, and what I want to do for this is just come to more current. See if I can find one. There's one there. Is it one? Yeah, that's a small one. Okay, so Brooks gap. So basically, what we're looking for here is, first, before we get onto this, let's just have a look on lower time frame at this red bar. Okay, so this red pin bar that's there, this one here, I want us just to pay attention to that on a lower time frame, and lower time frame is going to be the 1 minute. So what is happening here? Price is doing its normal thing, okay, but there are levels that are being breached and then being retested. So have a look here. Price forms. There's a level there. You see to the left here, there's a level. Prices come down, test the level, bounced up. Test the level again, then it breaks through the level. What happens with every breakout? It comes to retest. You can see it comes down, retest, retest. Down, forms a low of the day, comes up, forms a high, another level, which is a higher low, or a higher high, okay, and then we break above this level out and we come back and test it. So every single bar on the higher time frame has a number of smaller bars. I mean, you can go all the way down to the 1 second if you have to. I don't know if we're going to get enough data for that, or we do. But ultimately, the exact same thing is happening. Levels are being formed, okay, levels are being tested, and levels are breaking. So that one single bar there represents a lot of action happening on the lower time frames. Okay, it just gives you a consolidated view in that time frame. So in saying that, essentially what is happening with a Brooks gap is you have the high of this time period there. Okay, I then have a breakout. The green bar is a breakout. But what do we expect to happen with every breakout? We expect this to get tested. Okay, you can see how this bar does come back to try and test it. There. But it doesn't succeed, it fails. So it has now left a gap. Now, why is that important? Well, price is going to come back and test this, close this gap. And it does it pretty much every time. And let's look at some examples. So there was the high of this bar, and we had a breakout on the next bar. So I would expect us to come and close this. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will do that sometime in the future. And look what happens. Price comes back and closes that gap. Okay. Look at an example on the downside. There's an example on the downside there. So there's the low of the day, or the low of the period. We've broken out. Now I would expect price to come back and test it. And look here on this bar, it does test it, and the sellers are there. And let's look at a typical scenario. We've broken out with this green bar. Price comes back and tests the breakout. Here's a high. We've broken out above the high of this bar. Price comes back to test it before breaking up. That one. Price has broken the high of this bar, and we now have a gap. So I'm expecting it to come and close, and it does. Come and closes over there. So the Brooks gap is always a magnet, and it's always something that you, when you see them, and especially when you see them on the higher time frames, like a weekly or a daily. I've got too much data loading on these charts. Let's kill that so we can switch. Okay, so when you see a Brooks gap on a weekly, and here is a Brooks gap with a weekly gap as well, so that's even stronger. So you know that that's going to be tested sometime, and it got tested here. Okay, and let's just use bigger lines here. So there is another Brooks gap. So you see there, and look where price went to. So the whole point of the Brooks gap is it gives you a level to aim for. There is another Brooks gap there. So sometime in the future we will come back and close that. And we have a small one sitting over here. Okay, see, there was the high. We've broken out, and we haven't come to test this breakout. So that Brooks gap is still open. And if I drill down to, for example, the 4 hour, you'll see a different picture. But on the weekly, that is a gap. And although we have this inverse head and shoulders pattern here, we do have a gap below, which is always acts as a magnet. So anyway, guys, so that's kind of how I look at the Brooks gap and how I utilize it. I probably place more emphasis on the Brooks gap than I do on daily gaps. I very, very, very rarely aim for a daily gap. I've been caught so many times chasing that dream that I don't even bother with it anymore. I follow what the trend is saying and trade with the trend, and I'll just take cognizance of those as minor levels. So on the daily gap, I will mark, for example, that, and then I'll mark that. So I'll mark them, and I'll use them as levels or as magnets, but very rarely do I actually get in here for a gap close, because I watched somebody trade that and lose a lot of money once upon a time. And when we're in a strong trend, often it'll just keep gapping all the way down. It will come and close them eventually, but it's not the primary focus. Your primary focus should be looking at your bigger levels, and if those levels hold, then you're looking to go against the trend. If those levels break, you're looking to carry on with the trend. So that's kind of how I look at it. But the Brooks gaps, I definitely take cognizance of, and I pay a lot of attention to them. And you can see here's another one. There's one there, and look what happens. Price eventually comes back to close it. Okay, I hope that explains Brooks gaps to you, and I will catch you later.